I told my son his father had died. He said, "Today's Chelsea's birthday. Can we talk tomorrow?" From that moment on, I no longer had a son. It happened in the kitchen, the same kitchen where we'd shared coffee every morning for 42 years, where we'd argued about nothing and everything, where Walter insisted the toaster leaned to the left and I insisted it didn't matter, where he'd carved pumpkins with our grandson, where he'd told me he'd loved me for the first time. And it was there, in that ordinary, familiar space, that he died. Walter was midway through a joke, something about the powdered coffee creamer I'd bought by accident. He chuckled, tapping his spoon on the rim of his mug. "If I drop dead from this powdered nonsense," he teased, "you'll finally know real guilt." I smirked, slicing a pear. I was about to shoot back with some half-serious threat about switching to tea forever when I heard a sound that didn't belong, a sharp clink, the spoon falling, the mug trembling slightly on the table. I turned. He was staring at me, his face pale, his mouth slightly open like he'd just forgotten how to speak. Then he collapsed. His head jerked downward, then to the side. One arm dangled from the chair, the other rested limply on the table. I didn't scream at first. I froze. I couldn't even remember dropping the knife. I only knew I was suddenly kneeling on the tile, shaking his shoulders, yelling his name over and over like a prayer I no longer believed in. "Walter! Walter, look at me!" But his eyes were already glazed. I dialed 911 with fingers that wouldn't cooperate. The operator's voice was calm, infuriatingly calm, guiding me through chest compressions while I pressed down on the man I'd built a life with. His sweater was warm at first, then less so. I think I knew. Even before the paramedics came. Even before the living room filled with voices I didn't know, and someone said DNR and massive cardiac, I knew. He was gone. They asked me if I wanted a moment. What was the point of a moment? The moment I needed was already gone. I sat on the couch. The heater buzzed softly. The house felt both loud and completely silent. Walter's coffee mug was still on the table, the creamer still within reach. The chair he died in still faced me. And after they left, after they'd taken his body, after they'd zipped him into a bag like he was a task to be checked off, I picked up the phone again. I called Brandon. It rang 5 times before he picked up. I was still trembling, but I managed to say it. "Brandon, it's Dad. He just collapsed. He's gone." There was a pause, a full second, maybe more. Then, in the same tone he might use to reschedule a dentist appointment, my son said, "Mom, today's Chelsea's birthday. Can I call you later?" At first, I thought I'd misheard. The words didn't compute. They didn't belong in the world I had just entered. He added, "She planned this whole brunch thing, and we've got people over." That was the moment. The exact moment I realized I hadn't just lost a husband. I had lost a son, too. I didn't say a word. Not a scream. Not a sob. My hand simply lowered the phone like it had become too heavy to hold. I hung up. The hum in my ears was deafening, a pressure building behind my temples. I turned toward Walter's chair, the same one where he used to sit for breakfast and midnight crossword puzzles. His body was no longer there, but the shape of him still was, and I sat beside that ghost, clutching the coffee mug he never finished, until my hands stopped shaking. The next few hours passed in fragments, calls I didn't return, texts I didn't read. I remember the coroner asking if I had someone to be with me. I remember saying no, and thinking it was the truest thing I'd said in years. Later that night, I climbed the stairs like I was 100 years old and lay down on our unmade bed. His cologne still lingered faintly on the pillow. I didn't bother changing the sheets. I thought of how many nights Walter and I had spent side by side in that room. 42 years of fobchiki, of falling asleep to his breathing, his muttering about cable bills and politics, his snoring. I would have given anything to hear that snoring now. I reached for his phone on the nightstand, not even sure why. Maybe I wanted to hear his voice on a voicemail. Maybe I was hoping there was something left of him in there. There was one missed call, outgoing, 10:42 p.m. The night before, to Brandon. No voicemail, no return call. He tried. Walter tried to call him before he died. Maybe he felt it. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was nothing. But he reached out to our son, and Brandon didn't pick up, didn't call back, didn't ask. My throat tightened. I pressed the phone against my chest and wept, not the loud cinematic weeping they show in movies, but something rawer, softer, a soundless shattering. This man, my husband, who had worked every damn day of his life to provide for us, who stayed up all night with a colicky infant, who built Lego cities and tree houses, who taught Brandon how to write a check and change a tire, had reached out in his final hours and received silence in return. And now Brandon had chosen birthday mimosas and French toast over his father's death. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I called again, trying to confirm funeral details. Chelsea picked up. "Oh, hey, Evelyn. Brandon's still thinking about it," she chirped. "We did already book a weekend getaway and, well, you know cancellation fees are steep this close to the date." I didn't say anything. She kept talking about how mental health is important too, and how she was just trying to keep things light. I hung up. I wasn't going to beg my son to attend his own father's funeral. The day of the service, the church was filled with people I hadn't seen in years. Co-workers, neighbours, even distant cousins I'd forgotten existed. They whispered condolences, said Walter was a good man, hugged me with damp eyes. But my son, he wasn't there. Not in the pews, not at the podium, not in the parking lot. Every time the doors opened, a sliver of hope sliced through me, then faded. After the eulogy, Frank, one of Walter's college buddies, walked up beside me and murmured, "Thought Brandon would be front and center today." I nodded. I didn't trust my mouth to open without letting the truth pour out. That night, when the last casserole dish had been returned and the house was empty again, I poured myself a glass of wine and walked into our bedroom. That's when I noticed the drawer, one I hadn't opened in years. I opened it, and there, buried under old scarves and mismatched socks, was a small wooden music box. Dusty, silent, waiting, just like me. The music box was small, oak, scuffed at the corners, the brass latch slightly rusted. I must have seen it 100 times in that drawer over the years, buried beneath forgotten scarves and socks with no match. But that night, it felt different, like it had waited just long enough for me to need it. I sat on the edge of the bed, the one still shaped to Walter's outline, and unlatched the box. The hinges creaked softly. When I lifted the lid, a delicate tune drifted out, a song I hadn't heard in years, though I could hum every note from memory. It was the same tune Walter used to whistle when he shaved, when he gardened, when he folded laundry with one sock inside out and acted like it was some mysterious prank the universe played on him. A silly, gentle melody. And now it played like a funeral march in miniature, every note echoing louder in the silence. Beneath the music mechanism, tucked carefully into a false bottom, was a small envelope, yellowed slightly at the edges, as if it had been there a very long time. Inside, I found a photo. Walter, younger than I'd seen him in decades, sat on a wooden bench outside our first home. A boy of about 7 leaned into his side. Brandon, toothy grin, scraped knees, the ghost of a juice box moustache across his lip. Walter's hand rested gently on his son's shoulder. A moment frozen in trust. And behind the photo was a check. Unsigned. Blank, except for the memo line. Only if you learn to tell the truth. The handwriting was Walter's, steady, precise. The same hand that had written out grocery lists, anniversary cards, and every bill payment for the last 4 decades. I stared at that line for what felt like an hour. Only if you learn to tell the truth. I didn't know if Walter ever showed Brandon this check, but he'd kept it, hidden it, and that told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't new. This had been going on for years. The following morning, I poured myself a cup of tea instead of coffee. I couldn't bring myself to drink what Walter never got to finish. Then I went to our closet, to the back of the shelf where we kept the old photo albums and tax folders. Taped to the back of one picture frame, our wedding photo, was a single silver key. He told me once, a long time ago, that he'd put a spare key there. Just in case I ever go senile and lock myself out of my own files, he laughed. At the time, I rolled my eyes. Like you'd forget anything, I said. He didn't forget. He prepared. The filing cabinet in his office groaned when I opened it, metal protesting the silence it had endured. Inside were rows and rows of labelled folders, bills, taxes, warranties, pension documents, insurance policies, all perfectly arranged. A man who never expected to die mid-sentence. It didn't take long to find the one I didn't know I was looking for. A slim blue folder labelled Brandon, Transfers. I sat down, placed it carefully on the desk, and opened it. My stomach dropped. The first page showed a wire transfer, $2,000 to Brandon's account. Then another, $3,500. Then $4,800. And then $12,000 with a note. Chelsea, medical, urgent. 15 transfers in total, all within the last 18 months. Nearly $50,000 in all. I felt my fingertips go cold. Walter hadn't told me. Not once. Not even hinted. We'd agreed, decades ago, when we merged our finances, that there'd be no secrets, no silent accounts, no undisclosed debts. But this wasn't just about money. It was about trust, about love, about the kind of rot that grows quietly when no one's looking. I flipped through the last few pages, searching for context, for a thread, for something that might redeem this. And that's when I found the letter. Folded between 2 statements, written on the same yellow legal pad Walter always kept on his desk. It wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to Brandon. This is the second time you've told your mother one thing and done another. I've kept quiet because I wanted to believe you were being honest. But if you lie about Chelsea's expenses again, or if I find out you've used this money for anything other than what you claimed, I'll have no choice but to cut you off completely. I love you, but I won't let you take advantage of your mother's trust. No signature, just Walter's unmistakable handwriting. The date? 2 weeks before he died. I held the paper in shaking hands, watching the ink blur as tears welled in my eyes. My mind went back to that call, the last one Walter made, at 10:42 p.m. the night before he collapsed. To Brandon. I remembered the silence on the other end. Walter knew. He knew Brandon was lying. He knew Chelsea was manipulating. He knew money was leaking from our lives like water through cupped hands. and he said nothing to me, to protect me, to spare me. I looked around the room, my eyes landing again on the music box, still open on the bed. He left me breadcrumbs, not confessions, not accusations, but pieces, enough to assemble the puzzle, enough for me to decide what kind of mother I was willing to keep being. The Evelyn from 2 days ago, the one who sobbed on the kitchen floor, would have forgiven. The Evelyn sitting here now, with the music box tune still playing in her head and the weight of that unsigned check in her lap. She was no longer interested in protecting people from the consequences of their own cruelty. 5 days after Walter's funeral, he came to my door. No call, no text, no warning. Just the doorbell ringing on a bitter Thursday afternoon, while the wind cut through the last brown leaves clinging to the front yard trees. I had just poured myself a second cup of tea, standing barefoot in the kitchen, when the chime echoed through the house. I knew it was him before I even checked the window. Brandon stood there on the porch, shoulders hunched inside his jacket, hands jammed into his pockets. He looked older than 5 days ago. No, not older. Smaller, like someone trying to take up less space in the world. Behind him, Chelsea sat in the passenger seat of their SUV, engine still running. One arm rested on the window frame, her phone glowing in her hand. She didn't even glance at the house. She wasn't coming in. She never meant to. I took a long breath before opening the door. "Hi, Mum," Brandon said, voice light, rehearsed, as if this were a normal visit, as if he hadn't skipped his father's funeral to sip champagne and post photos of Chelsea's birthday brunch online. I stepped aside without a word, letting him in. He walked into the living room slowly, glancing around like everything looked unfamiliar, like this wasn't the same house where he'd grown up, where he'd taped finger paintings to the fridge and eaten peanut butter straight from the jar. Walter's recliner was still where he left it. The room still smelled like lemon oil and old books, and grief. "Want some coffee?" I asked out of habit more than hospitality. "No, I'm okay," he said, settling onto the edge of the couch like he might bolt at any second. I sat across from him, quietly reaching into the pocket of my cardigan to press record on the small device tucked there. I hadn't planned to use it that day, but I no longer trusted myself to remember what was real, and I no longer trusted him not to rewrite history when it suited him. He started with a sigh, like the weight of this moment belonged to him. "Chelsea thinks I should have come sooner, and she's probably right." I didn't respond. I wasn't going to make this easy. He kept going, grasping for excuses. "We had everything planned already, you know how it is. She'd been looking forward to her birthday for months. And with how stressed she's been lately." I tilted my head. She was too stressed to reschedule mimosas for her father-in-law's funeral. He flinched slightly, then shrugged. "I'm not saying it was the right call. I'm just saying we were caught off guard." That was the phrase he landed on. Caught off guard. As if Walter's heart had failed simply to inconvenience him. "I saw the photos," I said. "The ones she posted. Bright dress, sparkly caption, champagne in hand. During the eulogy." He looked away, picked at a hangnail, didn't apologize. I let the silence settle, thick and uncomfortable. He broke first. "We've been going through a rough patch, okay? Financially. I was going to tell you eventually. We just needed a little help getting back on track. It wasn't some grand scheme. Dad knew. He helped." I nodded slowly. He helped, without telling me. That's between me and him. I reached under the table and pulled out the folded letter. the one Walter had written but never sent. Then you might want to read what he didn't get a chance to say. Brandon took it hesitantly, opened it. His eyes scanned quickly, lips tightening as he read. When he finished, he let out a dry breath and said, "He didn't mean it like that." I stared at him. He wrote it, in his own hand, 2 weeks before he died. Brandon shook his head. He was probably just blowing off steam. Dad was dramatic sometimes. You know that. I leaned forward, my voice steady. He said if you lied again, he'd cut you off. That's not drama, Brandon. That's a line in the sand. He didn't meet my eyes. He didn't ask how I was holding up. He didn't mention the funeral. Instead, he crossed his arms and said, "Those were loans, Mum. We were going to pay them back. It's not like we were stealing." "Then why didn't you tell me?" I asked. "Why all the secrecy?" "We didn't want to worry you." The irony hit so hard I almost laughed. I had worried for 42 years. About school projects, scrapes on his knees, college tuition, his first apartment, whether he was eating enough vegetables. I had worried about every stage of his life, but the one thing he'd kept from me was the way he drained his father dry. And now he wanted to pretend it was compassion. Outside, a horn honked twice. Quick, impatient. Chelsea, right on cue. Brandon stood, awkwardly smoothing his shirt. "She's probably cold." "Then go," I said, standing as well, "and let me know if I need anything from you." He paused, like he might try one last time to justify himself. But there was no fire in him, no grief, just the hollow discomfort of a man who'd been caught in a lie, but still believed he deserved sympathy. He turned without another word and walked out the door. Chelsea didn't even look at me. She stared straight ahead, her jaw tight, her hands on the wheel like she was waiting for a red light to turn green. As Brandon climbed in, she reached over and touched his arm, reassurance or control, I couldn't tell. Then they were gone, and I was alone again. I stood on the porch for a moment longer, watching the clouds roll low over the neighborhood, grey and shapeless. Walter would have told me rain was coming. He always could smell it before it hit. I went back inside and locked the door. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I sat down in Walter's chair, picked up the mug he'd never finished, and whispered to the quiet, "You were right. He's not the boy we raised." And in that moment, I made a promise. No more pretending, no more excuses. They thought I was alone. They thought I was grieving. And I was. But they forgot that grief is not weakness. Sometimes grief is just the waiting room before justice. The morning after Brandon left, I didn't sleep in. I woke before dawn, the house still wrapped in that impossible quiet. I didn't reach for Walter's pillow this time. I didn't stare at the ceiling waiting for numbness to pass. I moved with purpose, folding laundry I hadn't touched in days, writing down questions I needed to ask, and preparing documents I never thought I'd need again. Grief hadn't disappeared, but it had sharpened, like a scalpel. By 10 a.m., I was sitting in the downtown office of James DeWitt, the same lawyer Walter and I had used for over 2 decades. James had thinning silver hair and a voice like steady rainfall, reliable, unshakable. The walls of his office were lined with oak shelves and dull-framed diplomas that looked older than me. He stood when I walked in. "Evelyn," he said gently, like he wasn't sure if I would break when I sat down. "I was sorry to hear about Walter. I sent flowers, but—" "I know," I said, voice quiet but clear. "Thank you." He nodded once, sat. Then, "So, what can I do for you?" I placed the manila folder on his desk. I want to change my will. James didn't blink. He opened the folder slowly and glanced at the contents. Inside, the handwritten letter from Walter to Brandon, the financial transfer records I'd copied from Walter's files, the USB stick with the audio recording of Brandon's excuses from the day before, and something else. A 6-page letter I'd written to Lily, our granddaughter, folded, sealed, dated, not to be opened until her 25th birthday. James took his time reviewing the documents, brows furrowed. When he finished, he folded his hands together and looked at me like he was seeing someone new. "Tell me exactly what you want," he said. I didn't hesitate. "Everything goes into a trust," I told him. "Every account, the house, Walter's stocks, his pension, the annuity, every last cent." "And who is the beneficiary?" "Lily." He blinked once, but didn't interrupt. "She receives full access when she turns 25, I continued. "Not before. Until then, early withdrawals only for education and housing. No cars, no jewelry, no impulse purchases disguised as emergencies." "And Brandon?" he asked. "Nothing," I said. "Not him, not Chelsea, not a dime." James was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We can structure it like that. But I assume you'll want an enforcement clause." "I do," I said, sliding another page across the desk. "If Brandon or Chelsea contests the trust in any way, legally or personally, Lily receives full control immediately, and they lose all visitation rights during the trust's active years." He raised an eyebrow. "That's harsh." "No," I said. "That's necessary." I leaned forward. My voice was calm, not angry, not shaking, just finished. "Walter tried to help them quietly," I said. "He thought he was sparing me, but he wasn't. He was enabling their entitlement. They've treated us like a safety net for years, and now they're trying to rewrite grief as inconvenience." James said nothing for a moment. Then, "Would you like to include the letter to Lily as part of the trust documents?" I nodded. "Seal it. Mark it for her 25th birthday. She deserves the truth, not the story her parents will spin." He scribbled a few notes, then looked up again. "Anything else?" "Yes," I said. I tapped the USB drive. "Include the transcript of Brandon's visit. Everything he said. Every excuse. Every lie. And add Walter's letter as a standalone exhibit." He nodded slowly. "I want this airtight," I said. "No loopholes, no back doors, no mercy." James smiled softly, not unkindly. "It will be," he said. We spent the next hour going through paperwork, drafting clauses, and reviewing my estate in detail. James was methodical, patient. He didn't question my choices, only ensured they could be executed. When the final draft was printed, I read every word. Then I signed, not with hesitation, but with clarity, not with vengeance, but with resolve. It was nearly noon when I left the office. The sun had broken through a thick curtain of morning haze. The air outside was crisp but dry, the kind of cold that wakes you up instead of slowing you down. I didn't drive home right away. Instead, I stopped at the cafe Walter used to love, ordered his usual, a hot Earl Grey with lemon, no sugar, and took it to go. Back home, I walked through the front door, removed my coat, and went straight to Walter's recliner. I sat down with the tea cupped in both hands, closed my eyes, and breathed. The house no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a beginning. I reached for the folded blanket draped across the side of the chair. The one Walter always complained was too itchy, but never stopped using. I pulled it over my lap, let the weight of it settle over my knees, and looked around. This was my home, my choice, my line in the sand. Walter had left me clues, but he hadn't left me instructions. He'd hoped, he'd warned, but he hadn't acted. I don't blame him. Love makes cowards of us all sometimes. But I was done being afraid. I was done playing silent partner to someone else's selfishness. I thought of Lily, 12 years old, bright-eyed, soft-spoken, and smarter than either of her parents seemed to realize. She didn't need protection from grief. She needed protection from lies. This trust wasn't just money. It was a message, a promise, a wall between her and the people who would twist her childhood into debt and manipulation. I sipped my tea slowly, my fingers warming around the cup, my spine sinking into the familiar curve of Walter's chair. Outside, wind scraped dry leaves across the porch. And inside? For the first time since Walter died, I didn't feel broken. I felt awake. I looked across the room at the fireplace mantel, where our family photos still stood in uneven rows, some dusty, some newly framed. And I whispered aloud, "This is the first time I've felt alive in weeks, not waiting, not surviving, living." And deep down, I knew this wasn't the end of the fight. It was just the part where I finally stopped letting other people hold the pen. 2 weeks passed. 2 quiet, careful weeks. After signing the trust, I didn't hear from Brandon. No calls, no apologies, no acknowledgement. Just silence, as if avoidance could act like an eraser. But then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, Chelsea showed up. I knew the moment I heard the car door slam that it wasn't a friendly visit. She didn't knock gently. She hammered. One fist against the door, 4 fast thuds, like I was a door-to-door solicitor she intended to drive away. I opened it slowly. She didn't bother smiling. She wore a camel trench coat, heels too high for the wet sidewalk, and makeup a touch too sharp for someone pretending to be concerned. Brandon trailed behind her, slower, head ducked like a boy walking into the principal's office. "Evelyn," Chelsea said, drawing my name out like it was something she needed to tolerate. "We need to talk. Inside." I didn't move. I didn't invite them in. I simply stepped aside. If they wanted to make demands, they'd have to do it on my floor, in my home, where the ghosts still walked. Chelsea entered like she owned the place, her perfume wafting in behind her. Brandon glanced around, the same way he had the last time, like this house no longer belonged to his memory. We sat in the living room, the same room where I'd confronted him with Walter's letter, the same room where I'd finally drawn the line between mourning and resolve. Chelsea didn't waste time. "We've spoken to someone," she said, crossing her legs, nails tapping against her phone screen. "And there are concerns." "What kind of concerns?" I asked, voice calm. She tilted her head, as if trying to sound maternal. "About your state of mind." I stared at her. She kept going. "This kind of sudden, dramatic legal action after a spouse's death. It's not uncommon. Grief does strange things to people. You might not be thinking clearly." I said nothing. Brandon sat there, silent as a statue. Then she added, "If you won't revise the trust, we're prepared to file for a court-ordered cognitive assessment to determine if you're still capable of making such decisions." That was the moment the air in the room changed, not because of the threat, but because of the audacity. She wasn't asking, she was cornering. I turned to Brandon. "Do you agree with her?" I asked, quiet and clear. He looked up, and then he looked down, and said nothing. His silence was the loudest thing I'd heard all week. From the stairwell, a faint sound, a creak of wood, the weight of a child shifting slightly on her heels. I knew Lily was there, halfway up the stairs, listening, the same way I used to listen to my parents fight, before I understood why whispers hurt more than shouts. Chelsea stood, smoothed her coat. "Think it over. We'll give you a few days, but we are prepared to go through legal channels if we must." She didn't say goodbye. Brandon didn't look back. The door shut behind them like a sigh of relief. I waited until I heard the car drive off before I called up the stairs. "You can come down now, sweetheart." Lily appeared, small and cautious, clutching the banister with both hands. She said nothing, but her face spoke volumes. "You heard all of that?" I asked gently. She nodded. I held out my arms. She crossed the room in 4 quick steps and buried her face against my chest. "I'm sorry you had to hear that," I said, stroking her hair. "But I'm not sorry you know the truth." She didn't reply, but her grip tightened. That night, after Lily went to bed, I sat at Walter's desk and wrote in my journal. Nothing fancy, just a spiral notebook I'd bought at the grocery store, the kind with flimsy lines and a bent corner. I wrote. She heard them. She saw him say nothing. She saw her threaten. And now she knows silence isn't always kindness. I didn't know what to do next. So I waited. 3 weeks later, I received an envelope, no return address. My name was written in careful cursive, slightly wobbly, like someone had taken their time. Inside was a USB flash drive, plain black, with a small sticker that simply read, "For you." I plugged it into my laptop, heart hammering louder than I expected. It opened into 3 folders. The first was titled Audio. I clicked it. Chelsea's voice played instantly, sharp and bitter. "Let her unravel. Let her fall apart. If she spirals, the lawyer will have to question her capacity. That's how we get in." My hand flew to my mouth. The second folder was video. The clip was shaky, filmed from behind a half-closed bedroom door. But it was clear. Brandon stood by the kitchen island, pacing slowly, his voice low but unmistakable. "Let the old woman do her thing. Let her build her little wall. Lily's just a kid. She'll see reason eventually. She'll help us, later." My breath caught. The last folder was a single text file, titled, "Note from Lily. Text." I opened it. "Grandma, I didn't know who else to tell. I heard them say things when they thought I was asleep. I know they're lying. I believe you. This is everything I could save. If you need help, use it. I love you." I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Not from sadness, not even from rage, but from something deeper, something like hope. I didn't cry, not yet. Instead, I backed up the USB onto 2 separate drives, one for the safe, one for James. I printed the transcripts, dated them, filed them with the rest of my documents. Then I sat in the dark, with only the soft ticking of the kitchen clock and the echo of Lily's words in my mind. She believed me. She'd seen what the adults refused to name, and she had been brave enough to bear witness. I didn't raise Lily, but somehow she was the only one in this family who knew how to stand still when everyone else ran from the truth. Later that night, I walked into her room, tucked her in gently. She stirred slightly, eyes fluttering open. "I left something for you," she whispered sleepily. "I know," I whispered back, brushing her hair from her forehead. Did it help? I nodded, eyes burning. You helped more than you know. I kissed her cheek and turned off the light. Back in my own room, I stood at the window watching the rain trace silver lines down the glass. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was waiting for a storm. I felt like I had already survived one. 5 years passed. It's strange how time can crawl in grief and yet sprint in peace. Lily grew. I grew with her, not taller, not younger, but steadier, more certain. We built a rhythm, the two of us, me brewing morning tea while she practiced piano in the next room, the house slowly filling again with warmth that no longer hurt to hear. On the morning of her 18th birthday, I was in the guest room, the one she'd soon call her own again, folding linens and making space in the closet. Her college roommate had backed out last minute, and she'd asked if she could move in with me for her first semester. I said yes before she even finished the sentence. As I shifted old books aside on the top shelf, one fell out and hit the floor with a soft thud. A leather-bound volume of poetry Walter used to read from when he couldn't sleep. When I bent to pick it up, a slip of paper fluttered out from between its pages. I reached for it. It wasn't just a note. It was a letter. Folded once, aged gently at the creases, the ink slightly faded, but unmistakably Walter's handwriting. I sat down on the edge of the bed and opened it. If you're reading this, I didn't get the chance to say it in person. I know Brandon is lying. I've known for a while. I just didn't want to break you with it. I hoped things would change. I hoped he'd come to his senses. But if he doesn't, if I'm gone, then I need you to do what I couldn't. Choose right. For Lily. Don't let silence become protection. Sometimes silence is the shield of cowards. You were never a coward, Evelyn. I trust you. I always did. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the sun to rise fully, casting its warm glow across the carpet. Long enough for the tears to dry before they ever reached my chin. He knew Brandon had crossed a line. He just didn't know how to stop him. And he hoped, prayed, I would. I closed the letter carefully, tucked it into my chest, and whispered into the quiet. You can rest now. I chose right. And she never let me down. That afternoon, Lily graduated. The ceremony was crowded, loud with clapping and calls and rows of caps worn askew. I sat near the front, not because I needed the best view, but because she'd asked me to be there. Close, visible, part of her moment. When her name was called, the auditorium quieted slightly, just long enough for the announcer to say, Lily Evelyn Hartman. She walked across that stage, not like a girl finding her footing, but like a young woman who had spent years learning how to stand. Her eyes met mine as she shook the principal's hand, and in that single glance, I saw the whole weight of our story, the secrets, the trust, the nights I'd sat beside her bed holding back tears so she wouldn't be afraid, and the mornings she'd left sticky notes for me on the fridge that simply said, We've got this. When the ceremony ended, people rushed to meet their children, their nieces and nephews, their students. Brandon was there too. I saw him. Back row, alone, a dark suit slightly wrinkled, hands clapping out of rhythm like he wasn't sure if he belonged. He didn't approach her. Didn't approach me either. He looked, though. Longer than he probably intended. I think he understood something that day. Maybe not everything, but enough to finally grasp what he'd lost, what his silence, his betrayal, had cost him. That night, back home, Lily and I sat at the kitchen table, still dressed in graduation smiles and the leftover glow of accomplishment. She set down her juice glass, looked across at me and said, "You gave me a life I didn't even know I needed." My throat closed. "I just cleared the path," I whispered. "You did the rest." She reached for my hand. "But you didn't let them block the way. That mattered more than anything." Later, before bed, she opened the drawer on her nightstand and took out the old USB drive. It still had the small sticker that said, "For you." She held it in her palm, then quietly placed it in my hand. "I don't think we need this anymore," she said. I nodded, fingers closing over it. A part of me wanted to destroy it. Another part wanted to lock it away forever. But I knew what I would do. I walked down the hall to the safe, placed the USB inside a sealed envelope marked "For Lily, only if needed," and returned it to the hidden compartment, just in case. Some truths deserve to rest, but never to disappear. As I walked back to my room, I passed the framed photo of Walter on the hallway wall. I stopped. For a long moment, I simply looked at him. His smile, his eyes, his trust. And I said aloud, softly but firmly, "She's going to be okay, love. We're going to be okay." Then I touched the frame, not like a goodbye, but like the passing of a torch. Because here's what I've learned. Silence can keep a family from falling apart, but it can also let rot grow in the cracks. Sometimes kindness isn't gentleness. Sometimes kindness is saying no. Sometimes kindness is walking away. Sometimes love is not letting someone harm the next generation just because you loved the one before. Walter once told me I was brave when I didn't feel it. I never believed him. But now I do, because bravery isn't always a shout. Sometimes it's the whisper behind a closed door, the refusal to be erased, the choice to protect instead of please. And if that makes me the villain in someone else's story, so be it. I didn't write this for them. I wrote it for her, for Lily, for the girl who saved me, simply by believing me. Silence may keep a family from breaking, but it can also bury the truth. Sometimes love means saying enough to the right person at the right time. If you've ever stayed silent out of love, I hope this story reminds you. Sometimes speaking up is the deepest kind of love. If you understand that, share this story with someone who needs to hear it.